Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are taking a deep dive into a tradition that is perhaps best known to the Western world through, well, breathtaking poetry and soaring music, yet somehow remains one of the most fundamentally misunderstood traditions in global spiritual history. If you, like so many others, have been captivated by the soaring, often heartbreaking verses of Jalal ad-Din Rumi, or maybe you found yourself transfixed by the mesmerizing rhythmic intensity of qawwali music,
Oh, yeah.
the kind that just elevates the soul, like the performances of the legendary Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, then you've had a glimpse into Sufism.
You've had a glimpse, exactly. It's often called the spiritual heart of Islam. But many people, even those who, admire the poetry, they only know it on a very, very surface level.
Right.
They might define it as a simple, peaceful path, maybe an aesthetic lifestyle,
Yeah.
or perhaps they categorize it as a tiny, highly specialized mystical sect operating, far away from the mainstream.
And that's precisely where we hit our first, and I would say arguably the biggest misconception we need to dismantle right at the start. If you're coming into this deep dive assuming Sufism is a small fringe group operating outside of the real Islamic tradition, we need to completely recalibrate that idea.
Exactly. The first key takeaway for you, our learner, is that Sufism, or Tasawwuf, that's the internal Arabic term its practitioners use, has historically played a major, significant, and sometimes foundational role in the majority expression of Islam across the globe.
The majority expression, that's a huge statement.
It is. For centuries, across empires and continents, it wasn't some separate phenomenon. It was simply how most Muslims internalized and lived their spiritual lives.
That is a crucial distinction. It suggests this is much more than just a footnote in Islamic history.
It's the main text in many, many ways. I mean, it remains mainstream in huge parts of the world today. Think West Africa, parts of South Asia. Its influence has touched everything from individual spiritual practice and ethics to the massive political organization of empires like the Ottomans and the Mughals.
Okay, so let's unpack this classification challenge then. We're clarifying that Sufism is intimately connected to Islam, but we're not categorizing it as a separate denomination or branch, like Sunni or Shia. So if it's not a separate branch, what is the accurate classification? What exactly are we studying here?
Well, it's better viewed as a practical, theological, and devotional tendency, or even a specific science within Islam.
A science?
Yeah. To use an analogy within the religion, think of it like theology or kalam, or perhaps better, like fiqh, which is Islamic law. Those are aspects or specialized sciences of the religion that all Muslims engage with or relate to, but they aren't separate religions entirely.
So Tasawwuf is the science of spiritual purification, or the science of the inner life.
Precisely. It is that aspect focused entirely on ethics, on purifying the soul, the next intensely developing spiritual practices, focusing on the immanence of God, and crucially pursuing direct intimacy or even union with God in this life through rigorous discipline techniques.
And it's important to note as we move through this that Sufis can be, and historically have overwhelmingly been, Sunni. But there are also important Shia Sufi orders.
Oh, absolutely. It truly transcends those denominational boundaries while remaining firmly rooted in the core tradition.
The focus is entirely inward, aiming for that profound internal transformation.
Right. And the path itself, the entire disciplined effort to achieve the state of being a Sufi, is what we call Tasawwuf. That internal term, tasawwuf, which literally translates to the path of becoming a Sufi, sets the stage for our first deep dive.
Yeah.
Figuring out where this path began and, how it got its name.
So we established that Sufis claim the tradition has existed since the Prophet Muhammad himself, whom they regard as the archetypal Sufi, right?
Oh.
Possessing the perfect balance of inner and outer religious life.
That's the claim, yes.
But the label Sufi itself appeared later. So why did specific pious individuals begin to be called this? Where does the word actually come from?
Well, the term Sufi emerged as a marker applied to specific renunciant individuals very early in Islamic civilization, perhaps because they really stood out from the rapidly materializing Islamic society of the 8th and 9th centuries. And there are a few competing theories for the origin of the term, each telling us something important about the movement's early values.
The most widely accepted theory, the one that makes the most, practical historical sense, is linked directly to asceticism.
That would be the connection to the Arabic word suf, meaning wool. This refers to the coarse, undyed wool clothing these early practitioners deliberately chose to wear.
Right, like a statement piece.
It was a stark sign of asceticism and separation from the increasing worldly vanity, the luxury, the fine silk prevalent in the rapidly expanding Islamic empire. Yeah. Choosing Suf was a public, tangible marker of their focus on inner piety over material comfort.
It's a statement of anti-establishmentarianism, a rejection of the comfortable ulema, the legal scholars of the time.
Exactly. It said, my focus is not on this world or its wealth. The second theory, though, roots them directly in the Prophet's era, which lends the tradition massive legitimacy.
That links the name to the Ashab al-Sufa, the companions of the bench.
This was a group of the Prophet Muhammad's companions, often impoverished migrants, who lived in dedicated poverty outside his mosque in Medina. They had no homes and spent their lives entirely focused on piety and religious study, living off charity.
So the Sufis saw themselves as their heirs.
They powerfully identify themselves as the direct spiritual heirs of this original group, carrying on their dedication to poverty and piety above all else.
And while scholars generally reject the third theory, linking it to the Greek Sophia or wisdom, it still speaks to the intellectual caliber of the knowledge they were after.
It does. I mean, they pursued a knowledge that was beyond mere book learning, a high philosophical and experiential wisdom. But regardless of the name's precise origin, the underlying phenomenon, that intense focus on internalizing the Quranic message and purifying the ego, was there from the start.
So when do we transition from these scattered, pious individuals to a distinct, identifiable movement in the historical record?
The distinct individuals being called Sufi start appearing around the 8th century, particularly in Iraq and Greater Syria. But the movement hadn't yet, formalized its spiritual path or its vocabulary.
Really?
The 11th century Persian Sufi writer Ali al-Hujwiri captured this perfectly when he wrote that famous line, "Today, Tasawwuf is a name without a reality, whereas before it was a reality without a name."
I love that quote. It acknowledges that the intense piety and spiritual striving have deep historical roots, but it marks the beginning of the path being codified, named, and systematically taught.
Mhm.
So who are these foundational figures, these proto-Sufis, operating in the 8th and 9th centuries before the movement was fully systematized?
We have to mention figures like Bishr al-Hafi, Bishr the Barefoot, symbolizing that detachment. But the absolutely foundational figure who revolutionized the tradition by centering the concept of divine love was the woman Rabia al-Adawiyya from Basra.
Her contribution is just massive. She shifted the focus away from piety, motivated purely by, fear of hell or hope of heaven.
Precisely. Rabia introduced the concept of pure, disinterested love. She famously said, "O God, if I worship thee for fear of hell, burn me in hell, and if I worship thee in hope of paradise, exclude me from paradise. But if I worship thee for thy own sake, withhold not thine everlasting beauty from me."
Wow.
She made the pursuit of God a pursuit of adoration and longing, which became the emotional core of the tradition for centuries to come.
So by the late 9th and early 10th centuries, this spiritual energy is really flowing. We start seeing parallel mystical currents emerging simultaneously.
Yes, like the Malamatiya, the people of blame in the East, particularly Iran. This was a radical spiritual movement that believed true piety should be hidden, and they deliberately sought to attract blame or contempt from the public by not adhering to external piety.
That sounds intense.
It was a harsh technique used to fight the ego, ensuring their piety remained solely between them and God. It's a key early example of internal diversity. And this group included Abu Yazid al-Bastami, who became famous for his deeply controversial, ecstatic utterances.
But the real turning point for systemization, the gathering of all these disparate ideas into a recognizable school, happens in one major intellectual capital of the time.
Baghdad. In the 9th and 10th centuries, Baghdad was the global hub of Islamic civilization, and it's here that the ideas of these dispersed mystics were collected, debated, analyzed, and formalized into a coherent movement that definitively self-identified as Sufi or Tasawwuf.
And this Baghdad school is critical because it gave us the essential vocabulary, the stages of the path, and the practices that still define Sufism today.
They systematized the concepts of the spiritual journey, the stations, the maqams, and the mystical states, the awal. Key thinkers included al-Muhasibi, who focused on ethical accountability, and critically, Junayd of Baghdad.
The leader of the school.
Often considered the leader and master of this school, yes. Junayd was essential because he advocated for a sober Sufism, one that balanced intense mystical experience with strict adherence to Sharia. His work was fundamental in establishing Tasawwuf as a legitimate, intellectually rigorous discipline, not just, a collection of eccentrics.
So now we understand how the movement was formed and codified. Let's delve into the actual practice. We've established Sufis were, first and foremost, strict Muslims who adhered to the Sharia, the external law. The 5 daily prayers, fasting, pilgrimage, that's the foundation.
Absolutely. That adherence was non-negotiable for the vast majority of Sufis. They weren't trying to escape Islam, they're trying to perfect it. In fact, they were often more strict about the outer requirements than the average Muslim, viewing them as prerequisites for the real work.
So what was that unique layer of aspiration that differentiated them from a legal scholar or a rational theologian?
Their goal was deeper, total internalization. They weren't satisfied with merely following the external motions and avoiding sin. They sought to purify the soul completely, moving beyond ritual obligation toward cultivating a direct, unmediated, and experiential relationship with God.
That's why ethics became so central.
It was paramount. Piety had to be genuine, emanating from a pure, selfless heart.
And that often manifested in extremely rigorous devotion, which we see in their commitment to asceticism.
Right. That led to renunciate lifestyles and the performance of supererogatory acts of worship acts beyond the required minimum, done purely out of love and devotion.
So things like extra prayers, extra fasting.
Many great Sufis would fast voluntarily year-round, perform night vigils, staying up most of the night in prayer, and often give away all their possessions, living lives of radical voluntary poverty. This was their method of soul purification, striving to detach themselves from anything that distracted from the divine.
This sounds like a deeply challenging, almost dangerous path to navigate. Which brings us to the esoteric nature of the tradition. What does esoteric mean in this context?
Here, esoteric doesn't mean hidden from the general public. It means emphasizing the absolute necessity of the master-student relationship.
Okay.
While the basic tenets of Islam are public, the profound secrets and nuanced dangers of the spiritual path are only disclosed to the student, the murid, by the master, the sheikh. You absolutely need an expert guide to navigate the ascending spiritual stations, the maqams.
It's like having a map but needing a Sherpa. You might know the direction of Mount Everest, but you need someone who has physically traversed the path to keep you from falling into the crevasses.
That's a perfect analogy. The sheikh holds the secrets of the path because they have tasted them and they are capable of transmitting spiritual grace or baraka, which aids the student's development. Without that guidance, the student risks misinterpreting their experiences, mistaking ego for illumination, or just losing their way entirely.
And the central focus of the murid's entire life, the real day-to-day work, is internal combat, what Sufis call the greater struggle.
This is the concept of jihad al-nafs, the struggle against the ego, the lower self, or the base soul. The nafs is the part of us that craves worldliness, seeks dominance, enjoys vanity, and is the root cause of all sin. Sufis are obsessed with purifying this nafs, stripping it of vices, and replacing those worldly attributes with the spiritual attributes of God.
This completely redefines the concept of struggle that many people might associate with Islam.
It does. It links back to that famous prophetic tradition, a hadith, often cited by Sufis. When the Prophet Muhammad returned from a military campaign, which they called the lesser jihad, he defined the greater jihad as the struggle against one's own ego.
Oh.
For the Sufi, overcoming the internal world-craving self is the ultimate lifelong true war. It's the constant discipline required to keep the nafs in check.
And once that ego is successfully disciplined, the Sufi is able to attain a different kind of knowledge, one that no amount of, university education can grant. This is marifa.
Marifa is mystical, gnostic, or experiential knowledge. It is direct, intuitive, and most importantly, attained by tasting, ṭuruq, the truth.
By tasting it.
Yes. Sufis argue that conventional knowledge, the conceptual, book-based knowledge favored by philosophers and theologians, only deals with the multiplicity of the material world. Marifa is the immediate illumination or direct perception of the divine reality, achieved by clearing the mirror of the heart through discipline.
And underpinning this entire rigorous journey, providing the passion and the drive, is the theme popularized by Arabia: love.
The Sufi path is absolutely framed as a love affair with the divine. It's characterized by longing, a profound, almost painful sense of separation from the beloved, who is God, and a burning desire for union. This intense spiritual longing dictates the fervor and commitment required to tread the path. This theme is not just sentimental, it's the engine of the entire spiritual enterprise, dominating Sufi poetry across centuries.
So to achieve that level of purity and experiential knowledge, the murid needs specialized, repeatable tools. And the most universal tool used across almost every Sufi order, regardless of geographic location, is Dhikr.
Dhikr literally means remembrance, and it is the ritualized response to the Quranic command for believers to remember God constantly. It is the central technique for redirecting the mind, which is naturally distracted by the ego and the world, to a complete focus on the divine reality.
Walk us through what this ritual looks like in practice. If you were attending a Dhikr session, what would you see?
Well, you would see travelers gathered, often late at night, under the guidance of a sheikh. They engage in rhythmic chanting. They might recite the 99 names of God, or more commonly, they chant the Islamic proclamation of faith. There is no God but God, la ilaha illallah.
And this chanting is repetitive.
Oh, very. It's done vocally, often in unison, and crucially, repetitively, perhaps hundreds or even thousands of times.
And the pacing seems essential here. It often involves movement as well.
That rhythmic quality is the key. The repetition and rhythm, often synchronized with movements of the head or body, sometimes forward and back, sometimes side to side, are designed to become trance-inducing.
Okay.
The goal is to reach a state where the individual mind begins to empty, the awareness of the individual self fades, and the focus rests entirely and ecstatically on the divine reality. Some orders use percussion instruments to further anchor the rhythm. This practice, in its various forms, was present even in the earliest days of the Baghdad school.
Moving from vocal recitation to intense spiritual audition, the second characteristic practice that we associate globally with Sufism is sama.
Sama means listening or audition. It's an even more elaborate form of Dhikr, focused on hearing, often involving melodic recitation of devotional poetry, singing, and significantly instrumental music and structured movement.
So not just recitation.
No, the Sufis recognized the immediate and powerful impact music has on the soul, making it a very direct spiritual technique.
It sounds less like a standard religious service and more like a carefully crafted mystical concert.
Absolutely. The scholar Jean During describes Sama beautifully as spiritual listening, with the aim of reaching a state of grace or ecstasy, or more simply with the aim of meditating, of plunging into oneself, or, as the Sufis say, to nourish the soul. The entire session is geared toward profound internal experience, not external performance.
And the ultimate desired result of this intense experience is a powerful trance.
That ecstatic state is called zuhd. Music, poetry, and movement, or dancing, are some of the most powerful techniques used to induce zuhd, which helps the soul traverse its spiritual stations toward God.
And this could get physically intense.
Oh, incredibly. To give you a sense of the sheer intensity, the famous Sufi writer El-Kushari relates a story from Baghdad where Sufis gathered around the mystic Dua Nun. When a singer performed devotional poetry, Dua Nun stood up, fell on his face in such intense ecstasy that blood was streaming from his forehead, and other participants displayed similar, physically intense, ecstatic behaviors.
That's a spiritual near-death experience. I mean, how does a person recover from that kind of physical and spiritual intensity?
Well, it's highly destabilizing, which is why the master's guidance is so critical. These experiences are bursts of illumination. They're not a sustainable state. The true work is integrating the knowledge gained during zuhd into the ongoing discipline of daily life, transforming those fleeting insights into permanent spiritual stations, or maqams.
Given that music and dancing were often seen as controversial in legalistic circles of Islam, has Sama always been universally accepted within Sufism itself?
That's a key nuance we have to highlight. While Sama was practiced very early on, especially the Baghdad school, it has been historically controversial.
Right.
Many orders embraced it as central, most famously the Mevlevi, the whirling dervishes, but others firmly rejected it as an illegitimate innovation. The Naqshbandi order, for example, largely favored silent Dhikr over loud Sama to avoid any controversy. This historical debate really underscores the diversity within Tasawwuf.
Before we move on to the ultimate goal, let's briefly revisit the early role of women. We mentioned Rabia, of course, but were they active participants in these practices?
They were, absolutely. Women held general importance as devoted mystics and even spiritual masters in the early periods. While the institutionalization in later centuries sometimes led to greater segregation, in the earliest days, there's clear evidence that women were active participants in and sometimes even led these intense Sama sessions.
That's fascinating.
Their early prominence highlights that Sufism has, at times, provided more direct and unmediated path to spiritual authority than other fields of Islamic endeavor.
So the rigor of all these practices, the fasting, the dhikr, the sama, the battle against the ego, it all points toward one single, supreme spiritual culmination that fundamentally defines the Sufi experience.
That goal is known as fana, which means extinction or annihilation. This is the profound point where the individual self, the ego, the nafs that has been fought against for so long, is completely effaced, or annihilated in the overwhelming reality of God.
Annihilated.
It is the highest station of intimacy, a state of complete self-dissolution.
When you say annihilation in the reality of God, how do Sufis avoid the charge of blasphemy or the idea that they are claiming to become God?
That's the critical, challenging question. Fana is not self-deification. It is a radical statement of self-denial.
Self-denial.
The mystic realizes that their individual self is transient, it's illusory, and that God is the only ultimate independent reality. When the ego is erased, the only thing that remains is the divine reality shining through. It's a realization that I am nothing, and God is everything.
Yet sometimes this intense, overwhelming experience results in utterances that are profoundly shocking and seemingly heretical to the uninitiated listener. These are the shathat.
These are ecstatic, often paradoxical or controversial utterances delivered in a state of fana or wad. The most famous example, which tragically resulted in his execution, is the 10th century mystic Al-Halash.
Right.
In a moment of intense ecstasy, he famously declared, "Ana haq," I am the truth, or I am the real, knowing that al-Haq is one of the names of God.
Which, to any rational theologian, must sound like a direct violation of Islamic monotheism. So why did his fellow Sufis object?
That's where the nuance lies. Many of his fellow Sufis, like Junaid, did not necessarily object because the experience was false. They knew that fana could lead to such a realization. Their problem was one of disclosure.
Ah, so he was telling secrets.
They believed Al-Halash was breaking the sacred trust of the path by revealing the secrets of the mystical stations to the uninitiated public. To the masses, it sounded like blasphemy, and it destabilized the relationship between the Sufi community and the legal authorities. It was an indiscretion, a loss of the necessary sober restraint, rather than pure heresy from the perspective of many mystics.
So it's the failure to translate the experiential truth into acceptable public language.
Exactly. Another famous example comes from al-Bastami, who exclaimed, "Subhani," or "Glory be to me." Both utterances point to that same reality, the complete dissolution of the self, where only the divine speaks through the individual in that moment of complete effacement.
So the lesson was learned.
The sober mystics, like Junaid and al-Ghazali later, learned from al-Halaj's fate and insisted that even at the highest levels of ecstasy, the mystic must maintain outward adherence to Sharia and sober discipline.
The story of Al-Halaj highlights the critical need for Sufism to defend itself and prove its orthodoxy. Moving into the 10th and 11th centuries, we see Sufism starting its crucial journey from a dangerous, dispersed phenomenon to an accepted, formalized structure. The first major step was, well, writing it down.
The first wave of textual systematization through Sufi manuals was absolutely vital. These writers were worried about the radical excesses of figures like Al-Halaj and the constant critique from rational theologians. Their mission was to demonstrate, using logical arguments and historical precedent, that Sufi terms, ideas, practices, and biographies of foundational figures were completely in line with the Quran, the Sunnah, and Islamic law.
These works were essential to legitimizing Sufism within the wider ulema community. What were some of these foundational texts that basically established the curriculum?
The canon includes works like Al-Risala, the Epistle on Sufism by Al-Kashari, which define the technical vocabulary and practices. Then you have Kashf al-Mahjub, the Unveiling of the Hidden, by Ali al-Hujwiri, which provided essential biographies.
Biographies of the saints.
Exactly. And Quwat al-Qulub, the Sustenance of Hearts, by Abu Talib al-Maki, detailing the spiritual regimen. These manuals showed that the path was disciplined, rigorous, and rooted in tradition.
But the crucial shift, the moment Sufism became not just legitimate, but truly the majority, mainstream expression of Sunni Islam for centuries, is associated with one towering intellectual figure.
That is Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, working in the 11th and 12th centuries. He is arguably the single most important figure in the history of Islamic orthodoxy, and his work guaranteed the centrality of Sufism.
And the context here is his personal journey, right? Al-Ghazali was one of the greatest legal and theological minds of his age, a professor at the Nizamiya University.
He was at the top of his field, and he experienced a famous spiritual crisis.
Right.
Yes. Despite mastering philosophy, law, and theology, he realized this purely rational knowledge left his heart completely empty. He underwent a profound spiritual crisis, resigned his position, gave up all his possessions, and spent years as a wandering ascetic, trying to experience the spiritual truths he had only studied conceptually.
He essentially walked the Sufi path himself.
Exactly. And his intellectual authority combined with his deep personal experience gave immense weight to his masterpiece, Ya Ulum al-Din, the revival of the religious sciences.
A revival.
In it, he created a grand synthesis of all aspects of Islamic learning, proving that Tasawwuf, the inner purification and ethical focus, was not an optional extra, but an essential part of being an Orthodox Muslim. His work ensured that Sufism was central to Sunni piety until the modern era.
That solidification paved the way for the next stage, the institutionalization of the path.
Beginning around the 12th and 13th centuries, the individualized spiritual lineages began to solidify into organized communities known as ṭuruq, which literally means path or way.
So they became spiritual organizations.
Yes. A ṭuruq is essentially a structured spiritual order based on the specific lineage, teachings, and spiritual techniques of a founder. Not unlike monastic orders and other faiths, focused on guiding the murid through the specific steps of that particular path.
And that guidance relies entirely on the silsila, the chain of transmission.
It does. Every initiate takes a master, and that chain goes back through the founder of the ṭuruq and, critically, all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad himself. This chain provides immense spiritual and historical legitimacy, proving the lineage is authentic.
And this lineage carries something spiritual and tangible, baraka.
Baraka is spiritual grace, blessing, or divine power that is transmitted through the silsila. A living sheikh is thought to transmit baraka just by his presence, his prayers, his breath. This belief in the transmitted grace is what justifies the practice of ziyarah, or pilgrimage, to the tombs of deceased masters.
Wait, isn't the practice of visiting tombs viewed by many other Muslims, especially reformers, as outright shirk or idol worship? How did Sufis historically defend this practice?
Well, that's the critical controversy, which is why Sufism faces such intense internal critique today. Historically, Sufis defended ziyarah by arguing that they were not worshiping the tomb or the person. They were simply visiting a place where the baraka of the wali, the saint, remained strong, making it an excellent site for meditation and prayer to God.
So the wali is an intercessor.
Yes, they viewed the wali as an intercessor or a channel, not a divine being himself. However, modern reform movements, starting in the 18th century and onwards, saw this as incredibly dangerous, blurring the line between monotheism and polytheism, leading to the outright destruction of many Sufi shrines in recent decades.
That tension makes complete sense in the context of their historical development. So where do these orders gather?
They gather in complexes known by various regional names: a dargah in South Asia, a kanaka in Persia, or a zawiya in North Africa. These centers are the beating heart of the order, often built in connection with the founder's gravesite. Rumi's tomb in Konya, Turkey, for the Mevlevi order, is the prime example.
Can you give us a couple of examples of these influential orders just to grasp the scale of this?
Of course. The Qadiriya, founded by Abdul al-Qadir al-Jilani in the 12th century, is one of the largest and oldest spreading across the globe, from Indonesia to West Africa. Then there is the more famous Mevlevi order, based on the teachings of Rumi, known for their iconic whirling dervishes. This institutional structure allowed Sufism to become deeply embedded socially and geographically.
When we look at traditional Islamic theology, especially the school systematized by al-Ghazali, the emphasis is often on God as utterly transcendent, totally unlike anything in the created world, the idea of tanzi.
Right.
Yet Sufism is all about radical intimacy and union. So how do Sufis reconcile this powerful contradiction between a far-off God and an intimate God?
Well, Sufis definitely uphold God's transcendence, but they intensely emphasize the verses in the Quran that point equally to God's immanence, his presence here and now, his closeness to creation. They cite verses like, "Whichever way you turn there is the face of God," or the staggering assertion, "We God are closer to them than their jugular vein." The goal of the path is to move the intellect away from emphasizing only the distant, transcendent God, and instead force the heart to experience the immediacy of the divine.
And that search for intimacy, combined with the concept of fana annihilating the ego, often leads to a profound statement of monism, the realization that God is the only ultimate reality. This idea is heavily influenced by one colossal figure in Sufi metaphysics.
That is Ibn Arabi, who died in 1240, known as the greatest master. He formulated the doctrine known as Wahdat al-Wujud, which translates as the oneness of being. His core idea is that God is being itself, and being is one.
This sounds almost philosophical. Can you give us an analogy to grasp how unity becomes the world's multiplicity?
I can try. Think of it like a light source passing through a prism. The light source itself, God, is a single, undifferentiated reality. The world, in all its apparent multiplicity, humans, animals, objects, events, is simply the reflection, the various colors, or the manifestation of God's infinite attributes as they pass through the prism of existence.
So the colors appear different.
but they're all made of the exact same underlying light.
So multiplicity is just a surface reflection of a singular reality.
Exactly. The world is real, but its reality is entirely dependent on the real, al-Haq. Taking that name of God, Ibn Arabi suggested that the core proclamation of faith, there is no God but God, can also be translated as, there is no reality but the real. Everything you see is a manifestation of the divine. This is an incredibly powerful, complex, and sometimes controversial concept that influenced spiritual philosophy across the Islamic world for centuries.
And this profound knowledge, Marifa, which Ibn Arabi is detailing, is reached by a specific method that differs sharply from the methods used by rational philosophers.
Yes, it's the knowledge achieved through direct intuitive experience and unveiling, or kashf, not through rational inquiry or philosophical thinking. Sufis fundamentally argue that rational, sequential thought only yields knowledge of multiplicity, the surface world, which is ultimately incapable of grasping the singular reality. True knowledge is experiential, tasted directly when the veil is lifted from the heart.
Ibn Arabi used a powerful analogy to explain this need for dual vision, to reconcile the transcendent God with the immanent God.
He did. He talked about looking at the world through two eyes. The first eye is that of rational theological thinking, which correctly leads to seeing God as utterly transcendent and incomparable. That's tanzi. But the second eye is the eye of mystical insight, which leads to seeing God as immanent and comparable to creation, or tashbih, the oneness of it all.
And you need both.
You need to use both eyes simultaneously to see the full reality. If you use only the rational eye, you miss the intimacy. If you use only the mystical eye, you risk heresy, like a halash. This necessity for balancing experience and orthodoxy is why poetry, which evokes both feeling and meaning, served as a much better vehicle for expressing these truths than technical, rational prose.
The one who successfully traverses this path and achieves this dual vision is no longer just an ordinary teacher, but takes on a metaphysical, cosmic role.
Accomplished Sufis are known as Awliya, or friends of God, often translated as saints. They are individuals who have reached fana and then returned to the world, a state called baka. They are annihilated, but they remain functionally present in the world to guide others. They hold immense spiritual authority and baraka.
And among the Aliyah, there is a hierarchy.
Yes, the highest rank is the Qatibah, or spiritual pole.
So there is an acknowledged spiritual hierarchy anchoring the cosmos.
According to this doctrine, there is always one Qatbi in the world at any given time who serves as the highest living spiritual authority, silently supporting the universe. This system is crucial to the Sufi worldview. Further influencing this is the concept of the ideal human or the perfect man.
The Insan al-Kamil.
Yes, under Ibn Arabi's influence, this concept was elaborated, the Insan al-Kamil. This is a metaphysical logos principle, the perfect mirror reflecting all the attributes of God. The absolute manifestation is the Prophet Muhammad himself, but the Aliyah are reflections, those who have fully realized ultimate human potential by embodying the attributes of God. The illuminated master, the Wali, is thus not just a wise guide, but a cosmic pillar who helps maintain the spiritual balance of the world.
Since Sama was such a central spiritual practice, it's no surprise that Sufism fostered an absolutely vast world of artistic expression, defining the spiritual landscape of the Islamic world for centuries.
Oh, the artistic legacy is probably why Sufism survived some of its fiercest critiques, as the art is undeniable in its beauty and spiritual depth. In the Persian-speaking world, you have giants like Jalal ad-Din Rumi, whose massive work, the Masnavi, has been called the Quran in Persian because of its influence. Then there is Farid ud-Din Attar, famous for the allegorical journey of the soul in the Conference of the Birds, and Hafez, celebrated for his seemingly secular love poetry that is actually deeply mystical.
These poets use incredibly rich metaphorical language to convey concepts like fana and marifa without resorting to theology. What are the common signposts for the listener?
Well, the relationship between the lover and the beloved is central, symbolizing the intense mystical quest for God, with the separation causing profound pain. Another common theme is wine, the tavern, and intoxication, which does not refer to literal alcohol.
Of course not.
But represent the direct, overwhelming, and sometimes maddening divine experience, the ṭuruq, that bypasses rational understanding.
Rumi's Song of the Reed is the classic metaphor for this longing.
It's the perfect expression of the pain of separation. The poem uses the ney flute, a hollow reed, to lament its severance from the bed of reeds where it grew. That plaintive sound is a metaphor for the human soul's cry of longing to be returned to its origin, its home in unity with God.
And we see the ultimate goal of fauna expressed so vividly in the poetry of women like Aisha al-Banunya.
Yes, the 16th century female Sufi poet Aisha al-Bonia articulated that annihilation of the self. Your beauty bound me tight, and when appeared the light, gone was my shadow, and nothing remained of me as it annihilated me as was right.
Wow.
This echoes the famous work of Ibn al-Farid, where the self is so completely effaced that the poet realizes, I was my only means to me, meaning the searcher was the one being sought all along.
And globally, the legacy lives on through the iconic image of the Mevlevi whirling dervishes and the sheer auditory power of Qawwali music.
Absolutely. Qawwali music, exemplified by Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, is a profound form of communal sama, meant to induce those ecstatic states of wajj and melt the hearts of the listeners, preparing them for the reception of divine grace.
We must correct the simplistic view that Sufis are merely quiet, aesthetic recluses, completely unpolitical. The historical record suggests that the reality of Tasawwuf and power is far more nuanced.
Highly nuanced. While many famous orders, like the Chishti order in India, famously maintain a policy of absolute renunciation, refusing all association with worldly power and imperial courts, living lives of absolute poverty, others were deeply involved.
Give us an example of a political Sufi order.
The Naqshbandi Sufis, one of the largest orders, held considerable political and military influence in Central Asia and the Ottoman Empire. Moreover, the Safavid Empire in Iran, which fundamentally established Shia Islam as the state religion, actually grew out of a powerful Sufi order called the Safaviya.
So they could be soldiers, empire builders.
Exactly. Advisors to sultans or radical recluses fighting internal spiritual wars. The diversity is amazing.
And speaking of radical recluses, let's look at the minority antinomian groups that intentionally challenge social norms as a spiritual tool.
This is a fascinating glimpse into the extremes of ego combat. We have to mention the Kalandariya and similar groups. They consciously transgress social norms, not out of wickedness, but as a spiritual practice.
How so?
This could involve radical behaviors like shaving off their hair and beard, or even publicly violating minor legal conventions. This was done specifically to fight the ego, the nafs, by attracting the contempt, scorn, and blame of other people. If everyone hates and disrespects you, your ego has no worldly validation to feed on. They stripped away the outward form of respectability in order to achieve the purest internal state.
So if Sufism was the intellectual and spiritual mainstream for centuries, what led to its marginalization and the modern narrative that it's a small sect starting in the 19th and 20th centuries?
It was a confluence of internal critique and external pressure.
Yeah.
Internally, the rise of modernist reform movements, most powerfully Salafism and Wahhabism, viewed Sufism as having drifted too far from the purity of early Islam. They viewed practices like ziyarah, visiting tombs, the reverence for saints, the awliya, and the emotional intensity of sama as dangerous innovations in superstition that had polluted the true rational religion. They condemned these acts as grave worshipping.
It was a campaign to demystify Islam.
Precisely. They sought to return to a textual, rational, and deinstitutionalized faith, often opposing the centralized authority of the Sufi sheikhs.
And externally, Western scholarship played a negative role, too.
Yes, through what we now call Orientalism. Western scholars often struggle to reconcile the sophisticated, pluralistic, and aesthetically rich ideas of Sufism with their preconceived, narrow, and often negative notions of Islam as a purely legalistic or militant faith. They frequently promoted the idea that Sufism must have survived in spite of Islam, or that it was an importation from Hinduism or Christianity.
And this combined critique,
both internal and external, led to Sufism becoming less institutionally prominent in many major parts of the Middle East, though its spiritual DNA remains everywhere.
Yet the tradition is absolutely alive and well, especially in places where the institutional structure remained intact, like West Africa.
Absolutely. In Senegal and the Gambia, for instance, traditional Tasawwuf remains a fundamental organizing social force, with over 90% of the Muslim population connected to Sufi brotherhoods like the Tijaniya or Muridiya.
And the tradition also spread west in a different form, often taking on a new universalist identity divorced from its Islamic roots.
This happened particularly in the 20th century. Influenced by Western esoteric movements, figures like Inayat Khan, a Chishti teacher, presented Sufism as a universalist spirituality, a path that emphasizes tolerance and love, but does not necessarily require adherence to the external elements of Islam.
And that's the version many in the West know.
Right. This version, focusing on Rumi's universal themes, remains immensely popular in the West today, though it sometimes unintentionally erases the very tradition that birthed it.
Today, it seems Sufis often define themselves in opposition to the fundamentalist movements that tried to erase them.
They often emphasize their role as representing a true traditional Islam that is tolerant, peaceful, open to intellectual inquiry, and deeply spiritual, positioning themselves explicitly against the hardline, intolerant versions of Islam promoted by groups like Salafism. It is a vital aspect of their modern identity and resurgence.
We've truly covered a tremendous amount of ground today. This deep dive confirms that Sufism, or Tasawwuf, is a vast, complex tradition that was, for centuries, the mainstream expression of Islamic piety. It successfully balanced stringency in ethics and observance of Sharia with the pursuit of the profound goal of fana, the annihilation of the ego in the reality of God.
Its legacy is woven into global culture, alive through institutional orders, the power of qawwali music, and the haunting profound poetry of Rumi and the other masters. Yet, as we've seen, despite its massive global popularity, especially through its art, its intrinsic Islamic content is still frequently erased or misrepresented in popular understanding. It is far more integrated, sophisticated, and historically significant than most realize.
And so, we leave you with one final thought, drawn from the metaphysical summit of the Sufi path, the doctrine of the Insan al-Kamil, or the perfect man.
If the ultimate spiritual journey culminates in the total annihilation of the individual self, realizing through direct experience that God is the only ultimate reality, the ultimate monism captured in the phrase, "there is no reality but the real," how does that profound cosmic realization change the mystic's ability to engage with the political, social, and ethical demands of the ordinary world? If your ego is dissolved and only the divine remains, what is the practical application of that realization in the mundane chaos of daily life? And how do you prevent that insight from becoming a license for social detachment or, worse, political oppression? Think about that tension between the ultimate reality and the pressing needs of the moment until the next time we take a deep dive.